This treatise, therefore, insofar as it deals with political science, shall be nothing other than an attempt to comprehend and portray the state as an inherently rational entity. As a philosophical composition, it must distance itself as far as possible from the obligation to construct a state as it ought to be. Such instruction as it may contain cannot be aimed at instructing the state on how it ought to be, but rather at showing how the state, as the ethical universe, should be recognized. Ido rodos. Ido kai to pidima. Hic rodus, hic saltus. To comprehend what is the task of philosophy, for what is the reason, as far as the individual is concerned. Each individual is in any case a child of his time. Thus philosophy, too, is its own time comprehended in thoughts. It is just as foolish to imagine that any philosophy can transcend its contemporary world as that an individual can overleap his own time, or leap over roads. The place roads. If his theory does indeed transcend his own time, if it builds itself a world as it ought to be, then it certainly has an existence, but only within his opinions, a pliant medium, in which the imagination can construct anything it pleases. With little alteration, the saying just quoted would read, "Here is the rose. Dance, here." What lies between reason as self-conscious spirit and reason as a present actuality, what separates the former from the latter and prevents it from finding satisfaction in it, is the fetter of some abstraction or other which has not been liberated into the form of the concept. To recognize reason as the rose in the cross of the present, and thereby to delight in the present, this rational insight is the reconciliation with actuality, which philosophy grants to those who have received the inner call to comprehend, to preserve their subjective freedom in the realm of the substantial, and at the same time to stand with their subjective freedom not in a particular and contingent situation, but in what has being in and for itself. This is also what constitutes the more concrete sense of what was described above in more abstract terms as the unity of form and content. For form, in its most concrete significance, is reason as conceptual cognition, and content is reason as the substantial essence of both ethical and natural actuality. The conscious identity of the two is the philosophical idea. It is a great obstinacy, the kind of obstinacy which does honor to human beings, that they are unwilling to acknowledge in their attitudes, Gesinnung, anything which has not been justified by thought. And this obstinacy is the characteristic property of the modern age, as well as being the distinctive principle of Protestantism. What Luther inaugurated as faith in feeling and in the testimony of the Spirit is the same thing that the Spirit, at a more mature stage of its development, endeavors to grasp in the concept, so as to free itself in the present and thus find itself therein. It has become a famous saying that a half philosophy leads away from God, and it is the same half measure which defines cognition as an approximation to the truth. Whereas true philosophy leads to God, the same applies to philosophy and the state. Reason is not content with an approximation which, as something neither cold nor hot, it spews out of its mouth, and it is as little content with that cold despair which confesses that in this temporal world things are bad or at best indifferent, but that nothing better can be expected here, so that for this reason alone we should live at peace with actuality. The peace which cognition establishes with the actual world has more warmth in it than this. A further word on the subject of issuing instructions on how the world ought to be. Philosophy, at any rate, always comes too late to perform this function. As the thought of the world, it appears only at a time when actuality has gone through its formative process and attained its completed state. This lesson of the concept is necessarily also apparent from history, namely, that it is only when actuality has reached maturity that the ideal appears opposite the real and reconstructs this real world, which it has grasped in its substance, in the shape of an intellectual realm. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, a shape of life has grown old, and it cannot be rejuvenated, but only recognized by the gray in gray of philosophy. The owl of Minerva begins its flight only with the onset of dusk. But it is time to conclude this foreword. As a foreword, its function was in any case merely to make external and subjective comments on the point of view of the work to which it is prefaced. If a content is to be discussed philosophically, it will bear only scientific and objective treatment. In the same way, the author will regard any criticism expressed in a form other than that of scientific discussion of the matter, sake itself, merely as a subjective postscript and a random assertion, and will treat it with indifference. Berlin, June 25th, 1820.